Yesterday, I posted following tweet. Some odd things evangelicals say. I believe in microevolution, not macroevolution. Evolution is a religion. I don't believe in the homosexual lifestyle, and I'm pro-life, pro-gun, and pro-death penalty. Now, this humble tweet, which amassed a mere 5 likes, received the following reply from a fellow named Marco. He said, "Do you think homosexuality is not a sin? Genuine question. I don't mean to be caustic." First thing I want to note here is what I was addressing was the ham-fisted way, in the particular, the issue of homosexuality or people who are same-sex attracted, the ham-fisted way that evangelicals often talk about this large, diverse group of people by referring to the homosexual lifestyle, which is a very odd way of speaking. It's like talking about the heterosexual lifestyle. Heterosexuality is not a lifestyle, nor is homosexuality. So the sooner that we can kind of get over that idiosyncratic language, the better. That said, so Marco asked a question. Do you think homosexuality is not a sin? And I responded by saying, what are you asking? Your question is ambiguous. Now, I don't have time on Twitter to explain why everything is ambiguous when it is, but I can do it now for you all. So the problem with Marco's question, to put it bluntly, is he was conflating different things. So a same-sex sexual attraction, is that a sin? Simply having a same-sex sexual attraction versus is it a sin to engage in same-sex sexual activity? Those would be two very different questions, for example. And this question as posed by Marco doesn't distinguish them, it conflates them, and that's a problem. So then Marco persisted and he said, well, I guess I'm curious to know if you think homosexual acts are forbidden according to the rules stipulated by Christianity. And I replied, no. My book on the topic will be out in a couple of months. So the book in question, which I hope will be out by June, I've tentatively titled How You Can Be Evangelical and Support Gay Marriage. This was Marco's reply. He said, I'm interested in understanding your perspective on this! Exclamation point. One more time for good measure. I'm interested in understanding your perspective on this. Now, you might not think that's really worth putting a spotlight on, Marco's response, except my first assumption here is that Marco has a traditional prohibition view about the topic, just by the way that he frames his initial questions. And based upon that, his response here to say, I'm interested in understanding your perspective on this really stands out. It's unusual. For the most part, what I get from conservative Christians who have the traditional prohibition view on the ethics of same-sex monogamous relationships is that it's obviously sinful, it's obviously condemned by the Bible, and that any defense of it is going directly against what is obviously taught by the Bible and thus is just unfaithful. What I find, in other words, is anger, hostility, judgment, but no curiosity, no open-mindedness. When Marco said, I am interested in understanding your perspective on this, that just stood out. I rarely see that. And why this is so sad is I always think back to the Bereans. When Paul was going around preaching to the synagogues in the first century, what he was preaching was crazy talk. I mean, he makes it quite explicit in First Corinthians. Foolishness and a stumbling block to Greeks and Jews. Nobody considered these claims seriously that the conquering Messiah of the Jews would die in humiliation and ignominy on a cross. That was a shock. And then to claim that that same individual would be resurrected, would achieve an eternal resurrection body in space time, that was an affront to Jews and Greeks alike. People would dismiss that out of hand. It was rare to find people who would say, I'm interested in understanding your perspective on this. But then when Paul in Acts 17 comes to the Berean church, That's what they say. They say, we're interested in understanding your perspective on this. And they listened to Paul with an open mind. And he commended them for it. They contrasted starkly with many other synagogues, notably the synagogue in Thessalonica, in reference in the same chapter. So this has created this term for us to be a good Berean. And to be a good Berean is to keep an open mind, to maintain intellectual curiosity, not to think that you have it all figured out, not to be hostile and antagonistic when people propose ideas different than your own, rather to emulate the Bereans as Marco does here by simply saying, look, I'm interested in understanding your perspective on this. I am writing this book for people like Marco, people who want to understand how you can be an evangelical Christian and support gay marriage. I'm going to make my case, and then you can certainly weigh the evidence for and against it as you see. But be careful about being hostile and rejecting things out of hand and being incredulous toward people who propose ideas different than yours. Because you don't want to end up in the synagogue of Thessalonica. You want to end up in the synagogue of Berea.